Imagine a distant time when the people of Israel stood on the brink of a promised land after years of wandering in the desert. The story takes us to Jericho, a fortified and imposing city whose walls were visible from afar and deemed unbreachable. Jericho was not just a city, it was a symbol of challenge for the people of Israel. Those walls, built to keep invaders out, guarded not only the city, but also the future of a people yearning for a home. After the death of Moses, the great leader who had guided Israel from Egypt, the mission of conquering Jericho fell upon Joshua, his successor. To grasp the magnitude of what was to come, you must envision the people gathered there, a multitude that had witnessed miracles, crossed deserts, but still had no place to call home. Jericho, the first major city in their path, represented the first true test of whether God's promise could be fulfilled. In this tense and expectant atmosphere, Joshua prepared to face this obstacle. Can you feel the anxiety of that moment? The hope, the fear, and the fervent faith? This is where our story begins. Joshua was a man of action, handpicked to lead Israel after Moses. He was a seasoned warrior, someone who had witnessed God's hand at work firsthand. But now, standing before the massive walls of Jericho, even he could feel the weight of responsibility. In assuming leadership, Joshua carried not only Moses' legacy, but also the trust of a people who needed to believe. God had promised him that he would not fail, that no one would be able to stand against him as long as he fulfilled this mission. Imagine, then, the mix of determination and doubt that might stir in his mind. With responsibility in his hands, Joshua knew his strength did not lie in weapons or numbers. No, the true power would come from faith. In silence, he pondered what would come next, like a leader on vigil, waiting for the next step. And then, as if in response to his yearning, he received direct instructions from God, detailed and precise. This moment between Joshua and God was more than just a conversation. It was a renewal of their covenant, a reminder that he was not alone. Joshua understood that he needed to trust, follow, and inspire his people. And so, with God's plan in hand, he prepared to take the first step toward the impossible. The words of God still echoed in Joshua's mind, renewing his courage. The promise was clear. Jericho would fall, but not by the strength of weapons, but by the power of faith and obedience. Joshua did not hesitate. With determination, he turned to the people, and they all anxiously awaited his words. He shared the divine message, the instructions that sounded unusual to a people expecting a bloody battle. God had commanded something that seemed strange. Instead of attacking, they were to march. For 6 days, they would walk in silence around the city, once each day, following the Ark of the Covenant, accompanied by 7 priests blowing ram's horn trumpets. It was an unconventional strategy for any military leader, but Joshua knew that this plan came from a power far greater than any army. He conveyed the instructions firmly, and the people, in an act of faith, accepted without question. The city, so imposing from the outside, began to be overcome by the inner conviction of those who surrounded it. As silence prevailed during the march around the walls, each step strengthened the people's confidence. Moving in unison, they knew they were building something greater than a victory. They were forging their identity as a nation of faith, obedient to the divine calling. And so, each day, Joshua and his people drew closer to the fulfillment that God had promised, advancing toward the impossible. As the days passed, the city of Jericho watched in perplexity. The inhabitants must have wondered what the silent march meant. They saw an entire army that, instead of attacking, moved in an unusual ritual around the walls. From within, tensions certainly mounted, and fear spread among the soldiers and townspeople who did not know what to expect. But for the people of Israel, each day of marching around the city reinforced their collective faith. On the 7th day, everything changed. That day, Joshua instructed them to march around the city not just once, but 7 times, maintaining their silence until the right moment. Anticipation hung in the air, and the city seemed to be held by a thread of suspense. On the last lap, the moment finally arrived. Joshua raised his voice and gave the command everyone had been waiting for. At the sound of the trumpets, the people were to let out a powerful shout, a cry that came from the depths of their souls. And so, with the sound of the trumpets and the collective shout, something extraordinary happened. The walls of Jericho, those very walls that had seemed indestructible for days, began to tremble, and, as if touched by an invisible force, they crumbled before their eyes. The silence that had prevailed until that moment shattered in a thunderous roar of victory. The city, which had once stood as a symbol of resistance, now lay at the feet of the people of Israel. With that, the promise was fulfilled, and Joshua, along with his people, entered Jericho, not as invaders, but as victors who triumphed through faith and obedience. With the walls in ruins, Joshua and his people crossed the rubble and entered Jericho. What unfolded there was a conquest like no other. They did not need to raise swords to defeat the city. The walls crumbled by the hand of God, proving that strength lay not in weapons, but in the faith that guided each step of the people of Israel. Jericho, once a bastion of resistance, now symbolized the power of obedience and trust in the divine. Joshua commanded the people to follow the divine instructions to the letter, refraining from taking spoils from the city. They were to consecrate the entire city to God, as a demonstration that this victory was a work that transcended their own strength. As they walked through the streets of Jericho, the people held close the memory of what they had just witnessed. There was no wild euphoria. Instead, there was a silent reverence, an awareness that they were living a historic moment, born from a covenant that required absolute devotion. Each of them knew that this conquest was just the beginning. Joshua, at the forefront, kept his gaze steady, already envisioning the next challenges ahead. But in that moment, as Jericho lay conquered, they could taste the fulfillment of a promise, a land that was finally beginning to unfold before them, shaped by the power of faith and the strength of unwavering obedience. As the people of Israel moved through the conquered city, the importance of obedience to God's will became increasingly evident. Each fallen stone, every piece of shattered wall served as a reminder that following divine instructions, no matter how strange they might seem, brought unexpected rewards. Joshua understood that the victory over Jericho was not just physical, it was spiritual as well. During the days of marching, the people learned to trust God completely, even when human logic dictated otherwise. They witnessed that faith was not about understanding everything, but about following with a steadfast heart, believing that the path ahead was guided by a greater wisdom. And now, before the city, Joshua knew that the next challenge would be to keep that faith alive, even without the walls of Jericho to prove its power. The silence that accompanied Jericho's fall echoed among the Israelites as a call to always remember the source of their strength. Joshua, aware of this, encouraged his people to remain faithful, reminding them that this was just the first of many victories to come, if they continued to follow God's will with the same commitment. The conquest of Jericho was not only about defeating external enemies, but about overcoming internal battles, doubt, fear, and the temptation to seek shortcuts. As they gathered to celebrate their victory, Joshua knew that the true wall they had torn down was that of disbelief, and that each step taken in Jericho would be remembered as a symbol of the unwavering faith that would sustain them in their upcoming journeys. With Jericho conquered, Joshua called the people for a moment of reflection, reminding them of the profound significance of that victory. He knew that the challenge now would be to maintain the commitment and faith that had led them this far. Joshua did not want this triumph to be just an isolated event, but a cornerstone upon which they could build a future of faithfulness. As he spoke to the people, Joshua emphasized how crucial obedience had been. They did not win through strength or cunning, but through trust in a greater power. He reminded them that they needed to carry that lesson into future battles and into every day of their lives. Joshua wanted each man, woman, and child present to never forget how the walls fell, through unquestionable obedience and unwavering faith. While Joshua spoke, the people listened in silence, grasping the depth of his words. This was not merely a lesson for the moment. It was a call to live with integrity, to be a people guided not by their own strength, but by trust in the divine plan. They understood that from that point on, they would face other challenges, but this first victory would serve as the foundation for all that was to come. On that day, as they dispersed among the ruins of Jericho, each one carried the certainty that strength did not come from walls, but from the covenant they had with God. Joshua's message echoed in their hearts, solidifying a commitment to remain united in faith and obedience, regardless of what the future held for them. With Joshua's words etched in their minds, the people of Israel began to move away from the ruins of Jericho, aware that this landmark was just the first step in a long journey. The city was taken, but the real challenge was only beginning. Joshua understood that they needed not just an initial victory, but a persevering spirit for the battles ahead. As they advanced through the promised land, they would encounter other fortified cities, other kings and armies that would try to hinder them from fulfilling their destiny. Therefore, Joshua called his leaders together again, emphasizing the importance of maintaining the same faithful and obedient heart that had guided them at Jericho. He knew that the temptation to rely solely on their own strength might arise, but it would be vital to remember that first victory and how it had come about. Every warrior, every family, every elder, and young person listened intently, absorbing the responsibility they had to preserve and strengthen their faith. The fall of Jericho was to be more than a memory. It would symbolize that as long as they followed together and faithfully, no wall could stop them. And with this renewed commitment, Joshua and his people prepared to move forward. Thus, in silence and with determination, Israel left Jericho behind, carrying with them the lessons of that day. They had witnessed the strength of obedience and the power of the divine. And now they were ready to face whatever lay ahead, with the assurance that as long as they remained faithful, each obstacle would merely be another opportunity to see God's promises come to fruition before their eyes. As Israel continued its journey, news of Jericho's fall spread through the neighboring lands, sowing fear among the surrounding nations. They understood that the people who had brought down such mighty walls were no ordinary adversaries. More than that, they recognized that it was the God of Israel fighting alongside them. Joshua perceived that as they advanced, the victory at Jericho became a living legend, a testament to all nations that Israel was not progressing alone. However, Joshua also knew that with this fame came new challenges. The kings of nearby lands were forming alliances to resist, and the path that had once seemed desolate was now becoming a landscape of growing opposition. He gathered his people and reminded them to maintain their focus and humility, emphasizing that true strength came from God and that they could not let pride or self-sufficiency take root in their hearts. Every city they passed served as a reminder of the promise that propelled them forward. The memory of Jericho remained fresh in their minds, a testimony that as long as they upheld their faith and obedience, they would be invincible. The confidence in divine power, built upon that first conquest, spread among them like fire, strengthening their spirits to face what lay ahead. Thus, Joshua and the people of Israel pressed on, determined and aware that the journey was just beginning. The conquest of Jericho was not merely a victory of the past. It was the driving force that motivated them to move forward, certain that together, with faith, they could overcome any obstacle that appeared in their path to the promised land. As the days turned into months and battles continued, the people of Israel carried the memory of Jericho as an anchor of faith. With each new confrontation, Joshua reminded them of what they had learned from that first victory. True conquest came from obedience to God and unity of purpose. They were not just an army. They were a nation bound by destiny, guided by the promise that sustained them. The lessons from Jericho shaped how Joshua led and how the people faced challenges. They understood that the struggles would not cease, but they learned that their strength lay in what united them: the confidence in divine promise and the commitment to a path of fidelity. Victories piled up, and the promised land unfolded before them, step by step, like fertile ground full of opportunities and trials. For Joshua, the fall of Jericho was a living memory that miracles happen when the hearts of the people are in tune with God's purpose. He understood that this was the true legacy he would leave behind. The reminder that faith is not static, but rather a journey, a series of acts of courage and trust that renew themselves each day. In the end, Joshua looked at everything they had achieved and saw what was truly important. It wasn't the conquered cities, but the transformation of his people into a nation forged by faith. Jericho remained there, in the collective memory, not merely as a milestone of victory, but as the first step in a journey that would turn promise into reality. And so, the conquest of Jericho would continue to echo, inspiring future generations to remember that with faith and obedience, even the highest walls can be brought down.